This is Logan Pierce, broadcasting from Mount Cascade on day 738 of the Red Dawn pandemic. The snow has melted from the lower elevations, revealing a landscape that is both familiar and utterly transformed. 2 years ago, the valley below was crossed by highways carrying thousands of vehicles daily, dotted with towns and settlements that hummed with the constant activity of modern life. Today, those same highways are green ribbons of returning wilderness, broken by the occasional convoy of survivor vehicles moving between the scattered communities that have emerged from the ruins of the old world. But perhaps the most significant change I can see from my mountain perch is the smoke. Not the chaotic columns of destruction that marked the collapse months, but the organized patterns of industrial activity. Planned settlements with manufacturing facilities, agricultural areas where controlled burns are being used to clear land for spring planting. Even what appears to be a functioning power plant, its cooling towers releasing steady white plumes into the clear mountain air. After 2 years of survival and adaptation, the scattered communities of survivors are beginning to rebuild not just their lives, but the infrastructure of civilization itself. The transformation accelerated dramatically after the spring awakening that began in April. As the weather warmed and travel became easier, the radio networks that had sustained us through the winter months evolved into something much more ambitious. A coordinated effort to establish physical connections between survivor communities. The voices that had kept me company during the quiet months were no longer just isolated signals in the dark, but representatives of organized settlements that were actively working together to create something new. Tobias Quinn's agricultural collective in St. Louis had achieved something that seemed impossible just months earlier. They had successfully planted and harvested their first major crop using seeds and techniques shared through the radio networks. Tobias described the moment when their urban farm produced its first surplus food, enough not just to feed their own community, but to trade with neighboring settlements. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since the collapse, they had created something rather than simply consuming the remnants of the old world. The success of the St. Louis collective inspired similar projects across the continent. Communities that had focused purely on survival during the winter months began planning for spring agriculture, sharing information about crop varieties that grew well in different climates and soil conditions. Dr. Elsie Mora, the veterinary epidemiologist who had first identified Red Dawn syndrome in Kazakhstan, had established herself with a farming community in Iowa, where she was applying her knowledge of animal husbandry to help rebuild livestock populations. Her broadcasts described the painstaking work of breeding programs designed to restore the agricultural foundation that would be essential for long-term survival. But the most remarkable development of the spring was the breakthrough that Dr. Camille Rourke announced during her April broadcast from Boulder. After months of careful research with her improvised laboratory equipment, she had successfully isolated the antibodies that provided natural immunity to Red Dawn syndrome. More importantly, she had developed a process for extracting and concentrating these antibodies from the blood of immune individuals. It wasn't a vaccine in the traditional sense, but it was the first effective treatment that could prevent infection in people who had been exposed to the virus. Camille's announcement sent shockwaves through the survivor networks. For the first time since the pandemic began, there was a real possibility of controlling the spread of Red Dawn syndrome. But the treatment was complex to produce and required blood donations from immune individuals, of whom only a few dozen had been identified across the entire continent. Camille estimated that her current laboratory setup could produce enough treatment to protect perhaps 50 people per month, a tiny fraction of the surviving population, but still the first ray of genuine hope that the pandemic might eventually be contained. The logistics of distributing Camille's treatment became the focus of intense discussion among the survivor communities. Nolan Ashford's trading network in Kansas volunteered to coordinate the distribution, but the challenges were enormous. The treatment had to be kept refrigerated, which required reliable power sources that many communities lacked. It had to be administered by people with medical training, and there were fewer than 30 qualified medical professionals left in the entire survivor network. Most importantly, decisions had to be made about who would receive the limited supply of treatment, choices that carried life and death implications for entire communities. These distribution challenges highlighted a larger question that the survivor communities were grappling with: what kind of society they wanted to build from the ruins of the old world. The radio networks had enabled remarkable cooperation and mutual aid during the survival phase, but as communities began to stabilize and grow, different visions of the future were beginning to emerge. Some settlements, like Sasha Whitaker's farming community in Colorado, favored strict isolation and self-sufficiency. Others, like Nolan's trading hub in Kansas, believed that cooperation and integration were essential for long-term survival. The tension between these different approaches became acute when communities began discussing the possibility of physical reunification. Marcus Bell's medical network had evolved into something approaching a regional government, with regular meetings conducted over the radio to coordinate healthcare, resource sharing, and mutual defense. But several communities expressed concerns about giving up their autonomy to a larger organization, especially when that organization was based hundreds of miles away and led by people they had never met in person. The children's perspectives, shared through Elliot Voss's broadcasts from the Montana monastery, offered a different view of these debates. The 30 kids under Elliot's care had never known the old world, and their ideas about community and cooperation were shaped entirely by their post-collapse experiences. They talked about the radio networks as naturally as previous generations had talked about the internet, and they couldn't understand why adults were so concerned about maintaining boundaries between communities. For them, the entire survivor network was a single extended family, and the idea of artificial divisions based on geography or ideology seemed absurd. The documentation work that Jackson Reeve had been conducting throughout the winter revealed just how much had been lost during the collapse, but also how much had been preserved and adapted. His travels between communities had produced a comprehensive survey of post-collapse technology and social organization. Some settlements had developed remarkably sophisticated systems for manufacturing basic goods using improvised equipment and salvaged materials. Others had created new forms of democratic governance that were more responsive and participatory than anything that had existed before the pandemic. But Jackson's documentation also revealed disturbing trends that threatened the long-term stability of the survivor communities. Competition for resources was intensifying as settlements grew larger and their needs became more complex. Several communities had reported conflicts with neighboring groups over access to water sources, arable land, and stockpiles of pre-collapse goods. Most concerning, there were reports of organized raids by groups that had apparently given up on peaceful cooperation and turned to violence as a means of acquiring resources. The threat of organized violence became a central topic during the Survivor Network meetings that were now being held weekly on a dedicated radio frequency. Grant Maddox's floating community on Lake Superior had been approached by representatives of what they described as a confederation of communities that had banded together for mutual defense and resource sharing. The confederation was offering protection and trade opportunities, but they were also making it clear that communities which refused to join might find themselves isolated and vulnerable to attack. The Confederation represented a fundamentally different approach to post-collapse organization than the loose networks of cooperation that had developed through the radio broadcasts. Instead of voluntary mutual aid and information sharing, they were proposing a hierarchical structure with centralized leadership and mandatory resource contributions. Some communities found this approach appealing, especially smaller settlements that felt vulnerable to attack. Others, including many of the communities that had been most active in the radio networks, viewed the Confederation as a dangerous step toward the kind of authoritarian control that had failed so catastrophically during the collapse. The debate over how to respond to the Confederation's expansion highlighted the fundamental questions that the survivor communities were still struggling to answer. How much individual freedom were they willing to sacrifice for security and stability? How could they maintain the cooperative spirit that had enabled their survival while also protecting themselves from those who chose violence and coercion? What kind of institutions did they need to build to ensure that the new world they were creating would be better than the one they had lost? These questions became more urgent when Naomi Greer's information network began receiving reports of systematic attacks on isolated communities. The raiders appeared to be well organized and well equipped, using military-style tactics to overwhelm the defenses of small settlements before stripping them of all useful resources. Most disturbingly, the survivors of these attacks reported that the raiders seemed to have detailed knowledge of the radio networks, including information about which communities had the most valuable resources and the weakest defenses. The possibility that someone was monitoring and infiltrating the radio networks sent shockwaves through the survivor communities. The open communication that had been essential for their cooperation and mutual aid had also made them vulnerable to those who would exploit their trust and cooperation. Several communities immediately stopped broadcasting, while others began using codes and encryption techniques that made communication more difficult, but also more secure. As spring turned towards summer, I found myself facing a decision that I had been avoiding for months. The radio networks that I had helped chronicle and support were evolving into something much larger and more complex than simple survival communication. They were becoming the foundation for a new form of human civilization, one that would determine the future of the millions of people who had survived the collapse. My role as an isolated observer and chronicler was becoming less relevant as the survivor communities developed their own systems for recording and sharing information. More importantly, the threats that the communities were facing required coordinated responses that could only be organized through direct personal contact and leadership. The radio networks had been essential for the initial stages of recovery, but the next phase would require people who were willing to leave their safe havens and work together in person to build the institutions that would govern the new world. During my morning broadcast on June 15th, exactly 2 years after I had fled to Mount Cascade, I announced my intention to leave the weather station and join the growing community of survivors who were working to rebuild civilization. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Voices from across the continent urged me to reconsider, arguing that my broadcasts had become an essential source of continuity and inspiration for the entire network. But others supported my decision, recognizing that the time for pure documentation was ending and the time for active participation was beginning. My plan was to travel first to Dr. Camille Rourke's laboratory in Boulder, where I could receive the immunity treatment that would allow me to work safely among the larger survivor communities. From there, I intended to join the coordination efforts that were being organized to respond to the Confederation threat and establish a more formal structure for cooperation among the peaceful settlements. It would be dangerous work, requiring travel through areas that might be controlled by hostile groups, but it was also necessary work that couldn't be accomplished from the safety of my mountain perch. As I prepared for my departure from Mount Cascade, I reflected on what the past 2 years had taught me about human nature and social organization. The collapse of Red Dawn syndrome had revealed both the fragility of our technological civilization and the remarkable resilience of human communities. People had proven capable of adapting to circumstances that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, finding ways to survive and even thrive in a world that had been utterly transformed by pandemic and social collapse. But the recovery period had also revealed new challenges that were in some ways more complex than the immediate survival issues of the collapse months. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive, but what kind of society would emerge from the ruins of the old world. The choices being made by the survivor communities during these crucial months would determine whether the new civilization would be based on cooperation and mutual aid, or on hierarchy and coercion. On my final morning at the weather station, as I loaded my equipment into the truck that would carry me back into the world below, I received a transmission that changed everything. The voice was unfamiliar, broadcasting on a frequency that had been silent for months. The speaker identified himself as Colonel James Morrison, broadcasting from what he claimed was a functioning military base in Colorado Springs. His message was brief but shocking. The federal government still existed in a limited form, operating from secure facilities that had been protected during the collapse. They had been monitoring the radio networks and were now ready to re-establish contact with the survivor communities. Morrison's announcement included coordinates for a meeting point where representatives from the survivor communities could make contact with government officials. He promised medical supplies, technical assistance, and protection from the raider groups that were threatening peaceful settlements. But he also made it clear that cooperation with the restored government would be mandatory, not voluntary, and that communities which refused to recognize federal authority would be considered hostile. As I started my truck and began the long descent from Mount Cascade, Morrison's transmission was still echoing in my mind. The simple binary choice between cooperation and isolation that the survivor communities had been grappling with had suddenly become much more complex. A third option had emerged: submission to the authority of the old world that had failed so catastrophically during the pandemic. The question now was whether the scattered communities of survivors would unite to preserve their independence, or whether the promise of security and stability would lead them to surrender the autonomy they had fought so hard to maintain. The road ahead stretched into an uncertain future, but one thing was clear. The next phase of the post-collapse world was about to begin, and the choices made in the coming weeks would determine the fate of whatever remained of human civilization. This is Logan Pierce, signing off from Mount Cascade for the final time. Tomorrow, I'll begin broadcasting from the road, and together we'll discover what lies ahead in the valleys below. This is Logan Pierce, broadcasting from an abandoned gas station 23 miles southeast of Mount Cascade. It's been 72 hours since I left the weather station, and I'm transmitting through a jury-rigged antenna system powered by my truck's battery. The silence up on the mountain was unsettling, but the sounds I'm hearing down here in the valleys are far worse. As I speak, something is moving through the tall grass about 50 yards from my position. The movement is too purposeful to be wildlife, too quiet to be human. I've learned not to investigate sounds like that. The descent from my mountain sanctuary began at dawn 3 days ago, and within the first mile, I understood why so few people had attempted to travel between the scattered survivor communities. The roads that had once carried thousands of vehicles daily have become corridors of death, littered with the rusted hulks of cars that ran out of fuel or broke down during the Great Exodus 2 years ago. But it's not just abandoned vehicles that mark these routes. Every few hundred yards, I pass what used to be people, their remains scattered by scavengers and bleached white by 2 winters of mountain weather. The infected bird populations that Dr. Mora warned about in those first terrible broadcasts have established themselves as the apex predators of the abandoned landscape. I encountered my first flock 6 hours into my descent, a writhing black mass of ravens and crows that had claimed the carcass of an elk near the roadside. When my truck approached, they didn't scatter the way healthy birds would have. Instead, they turned toward me with a coordinated movement that was distinctly unnatural, their eyes rimmed with that familiar crimson inflammation. I gunned the engine and drove straight through their midst, feeling the sickening impact of bodies against my windshield while trying not to breathe the cloud of feathers and disease that surrounded my vehicle. The towns I passed through during my first day on the road were monuments to the speed and completeness of the collapse. Riverside, population 4,000 according to the bullet-riddled welcome sign, appeared to have been abandoned in a matter of hours. Cars sat in driveways with their doors hanging open, as if their owners had simply walked away mid-conversation. The windows of houses stared blindly across empty streets, many of them broken by hail or falling tree branches that no one had been left to repair. Weeds and volunteer trees were already beginning to crack the asphalt and invade the foundations of buildings that had once housed families and businesses. But it was the silence that was most disturbing, not the peaceful quiet of the wilderness, but the oppressive absence of all the sounds that make a place feel alive. No dogs barking, no children playing, no distant hum of air conditioning or traffic, just the whisper of wind through broken windows and the occasional crack of settling wood as empty buildings slowly collapsed under their own weight. I tried calling out, thinking there might be someone hiding in the shadows who was afraid to reveal themselves. My voice echoed off the empty facades and died away without answer, leaving me more alone than I had ever felt on my isolated mountain. The real horror began when I stopped for the night in what had been Millbrook, a larger town of about 12,000 people that had boasted a regional hospital and shopping center. I chose a sturdy-looking brick building that had been a pharmacy, thinking it might still contain medical supplies that could be useful for my journey to Boulder. The front windows had been smashed long ago, but the interior was remarkably intact, suggesting that looters had found little worth taking. As I explored the building by flashlight, I began to understand why. The pharmacy's prescription records were still scattered across the floor behind the counter, and reading them in the harsh beam of my flashlight painted a picture of the final weeks before the town was abandoned. Page after page of desperate prescriptions for fever reducers, pain medication, and respiratory treatments. Antibiotics prescribed in quantities that suggested doctors were trying anything they could think of to fight an infection they didn't understand. Most chilling were the dates. The final prescriptions were filled on July 30th, exactly 1 month after the World Health Organization's pandemic declaration, suggesting that this town had held out longer than most before finally succumbing to the inevitable. I spent the night barricaded in the pharmacy's back office, listening to sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Footsteps that stopped whenever I tried to locate their source. The creak of floorboards in empty buildings where no one should have been walking. Most unsettling was a sound that took me hours to identify, the rhythmic scratching of claws on metal, as if something was trying to claw its way through the aluminum siding of the buildings around me. When dawn finally came, I found deep gouges in the metal sheeting outside my shelter, parallel scratches that were too large to have been made by any animal I could imagine. My second day on the road brought me into contact with the first evidence of the raider groups that had been terrorizing the radio networks. I was following what had been Highway 85 south toward Denver when I crested a hill and saw the remains of what must have been a survivor convoy. 3 vehicles had been stopped at a makeshift roadblock constructed from concrete barriers and twisted metal. The vehicles themselves had been stripped of everything useful, their tires removed, their fuel tanks drained, their windows shot out. But it was the state of the passengers that made me pull over and vomit into the roadside weeds. The raiders had left the bodies as a message, arranged in poses that were clearly intended to terrorize anyone who might find them. Men, women, and children who had been trying to reach safety somewhere, murdered not just for their possessions, but as a demonstration of power. I counted 17 victims, including at least 4 children whose small forms had been placed in the center of the display. The bodies were old enough that decomposition had made identification impossible, but fresh enough that this had happened within the past few months. Someone was still actively hunting the roads between survivor communities. The roadblock itself showed signs of sophisticated planning. The barriers had been positioned to force approaching vehicles into a kill zone where they could be attacked from multiple directions. Radio antennas mounted on tall poles suggested that the raiders were monitoring emergency frequencies and could coordinate their attacks across a wide area. Most disturbing, the entire ambush site had been carefully maintained, with the barriers repositioned to block any attempt to drive around them and warning signs posted in multiple languages. This wasn't opportunistic violence by desperate survivors. This was organized warfare. I spent an hour trying to find a way around the roadblock before realizing that any alternate route would take me far off my planned course toward Boulder. The barriers could be moved, but doing so would require me to get out of my truck and expose myself to whatever surveillance the raiders might have left behind. As I worked to clear a narrow passage through the concrete blocks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line that bordered the highway. Every few minutes, I would catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The feeling of being stalked intensified as I continued south through the abandoned suburbs that had once surrounded Denver. The houses here were larger and more expensive than the rural communities I had passed through, but they showed the same signs of hasty abandonment. Swimming pools had become stagnant breeding grounds for mosquitoes and worse things. Landscaped yards had reverted to tall grass and volunteer trees that provided perfect concealment for anyone who might be tracking my movement. The streets were littered with debris that seemed to have been deliberately placed to slow down vehicles and force them into predictable paths. It was in one of these suburban developments that I encountered my first evidence of the Confederation that Grant Maddox had warned about during his radio broadcasts. A large banner had been strung between two telephone poles, its message visible from several blocks away. Confederation territory, authorized personnel only, violators will be shot. The lettering was professionally done, suggesting access to equipment and resources that went far beyond what most survivor communities possessed. Below the main message, in smaller text, was a radio frequency and a set of coordinates for what was labeled as Regional Command. I tried monitoring the specified frequency as I drove past the banner, but heard only static and occasional bursts of what sounded like coded transmissions. The coordinates placed the Regional Command Center somewhere in the foothills west of Denver, roughly along my planned route to Boulder. The Confederation's presence in this area meant that Dr. Camille Rourke's laboratory might already be under their control, or at least within their sphere of influence. My mission to obtain immunity treatment was becoming more complicated and dangerous than I had anticipated. The true scope of the Confederation's organization became clear when I reached the outskirts of what had been Lakewood, a Denver suburb of over 100,000 people. The main road into the city had been completely blocked by a professional-looking checkpoint, complete with concrete barriers, razor wire, and what appeared to be permanent guard posts. Unlike the crude roadblock where I had found the massacre victims, this installation showed every sign of being occupied and actively maintained. Fresh tire tracks led up to the barriers, and the guard posts had been recently painted. More significantly, the checkpoint was equipped with solar panels and radio antennas that suggested sophisticated communication capabilities. A large sign announced that this was Confederation Checkpoint 7 and listed strict protocols for anyone seeking to enter the controlled zone. All vehicles were to be searched, all personnel were to be documented and issued identification cards, and anyone found to be carrying weapons or subversive materials would be detained indefinitely. The bottom of the sign included a list of approved reasons for entering the zone, all of which required prior authorization from Regional Command. I parked my truck behind a stand of trees about half a mile from the checkpoint and spent several hours observing the installation through binoculars. During that time, I saw no vehicle traffic in either direction, but the guards were clearly active and alert. Two figures in military-style uniforms patrolled the perimeter regularly, and I could see the glint of sunlight off what appeared to be rifle scopes mounted in the guard towers. This was not a casual operation run by desperate survivors. This was a military organization with training, equipment, and discipline. The radio traffic I intercepted while observing the checkpoint was even more disturbing than the installation itself. The guards were in regular communication with multiple other checkpoints, reporting on traffic patterns, resource deliveries, and what they referred to as population management activities. They spoke in codes and abbreviations, but the general meaning was clear. The Confederation was actively controlling movement and commerce across a large area, and they were treating the civilian population more like prisoners than citizens. Most chilling was a transmission I recorded just before sunset, when the guard shift was changing. The outgoing supervisor reported that Package 17 had been successfully delivered to Processing Center Delta, and that the next harvest was scheduled for the following week. When the incoming supervisor asked for clarification about target demographics, the response was simply anyone with technical skills or medical training. The Confederation wasn't just controlling territory, they were actively hunting and capturing people with specific expertise. As darkness fell, I realized that my original plan to reach Boulder by following the main highways was no longer viable. The Confederation's checkpoint system appeared to cover all the major routes into the Denver metropolitan area, and attempting to pass through their control points would likely result in my detention or worse. I would have to find an alternate route through the mountainous terrain to the west, adding days to my journey and exposing me to additional dangers from both the infected wildlife and the harsh environment. But perhaps more importantly, I now understood that the situation facing the survivor communities was far more serious than the radio broadcasts had suggested. The Confederation was not simply a mutual defense alliance or a loose confederation of communities seeking security. It was an organized military force that was systematically conquering territory and enslaving the surviving population. Dr. Camille Rourke's immunity research, if it still existed, might be the only thing that could level the playing field between the peaceful survivor communities and this emerging authoritarian state. I spent that night hidden in the basement of an abandoned house, listening to the radio chatter from Confederation patrols as they coordinated their movements across the metropolitan area. The scope of their operation was staggering. They had checkpoints on every major road, patrol routes that covered hundreds of square miles, and communication networks that rivaled anything that had existed before the collapse. Most disturbing, they were actively expanding their territory, with references to consolidation operations in areas that had previously been free of their control. The voices I heard on the Confederation frequencies were professional and disciplined, but they were also cold and dehumanizing in their references to the civilian population. Survivor communities were referred to as resource concentrations or labor pools. Individual people were discussed in terms of their utility value, with specific emphasis on technical skills, physical capability, and reproductive potential. These were not people who saw themselves as part of the human community they were controlling. They saw themselves as a separate and superior class with the right to rule over the survivors of the collapse. As I prepared to leave my hiding place before dawn, I received a transmission that made my blood run cold. It was Dr. Camille Rourke's voice, but she was not broadcasting from her laboratory in Boulder. Instead, she was speaking from what she identified as Confederation Research Facility Alpha, and her message was a formal announcement of new medical protocols for the controlled territories. The immunity treatment that had represented such hope for the survivor communities was now under Confederation control, and it was being used as a tool of coercion rather than healing. According to Camille's carefully scripted announcement, immunity treatment would be available only to individuals who had demonstrated loyalty and productivity within the Confederation system. Priority would be given to essential personnel, military units, and selected civilian leaders who had proven their value to the organization. The vast majority of the population would remain vulnerable to infection, making them dependent on Confederation protection and unable to operate independently in the infected zones that surrounded the controlled territories. As I listened to Camille's voice, I could hear the strain and fear underneath her professional delivery. This was not a willing collaboration, but a forced cooperation under threat. The Confederation had captured not just her research, but her person, and they were using both to advance their campaign of territorial conquest. The hope that her immunity treatment had represented for the free survivor communities had been transformed into another weapon in the Confederation's arsenal of control. The sun is rising now as I finish this transmission, and I can see smoke on the horizon that marks the location of what must be a Confederation patrol. They're moving systematically through this area, probably following reports of my truck from their checkpoint surveillance network. I have perhaps an hour before they reach my position, and I need to move deeper into the mountains if I'm going to have any chance of reaching the free territories beyond their control. But before I sign off, I need to share what I've learned with the survivor communities that are still listening. The Confederation is not what it appears to be in their recruitment broadcasts. They are not offering mutual protection and voluntary cooperation. They are building a slave state on the ruins of the free world, using military force and medical coercion to subjugate anyone who survives within their expanding territory. The peaceful communities that we've worked so hard to build are directly in their path, and they will not be satisfied with anything less than total control. The question now is whether the scattered survivor communities can organize themselves quickly enough to resist this threat, or whether the dream of rebuilding a free and cooperative society will die before it has a chance to fully emerge. This is Logan Pierce, broadcasting from the contested territories, and tomorrow I'll tell you what I found when I finally reached the free zones beyond Confederation control. This is Logan Pierce, broadcasting from a hidden location in the Colorado Rockies on day 747 of the Red Dawn pandemic. I'm transmitting through a makeshift relay system built into the ruins of an old mining operation, speaking to you from tunnels that haven't seen human occupation since the 1940s. The air down here tastes of copper and fear, and the only light comes from battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on walls carved by men who died long before our world ended. But these tunnels, forgotten by time and invisible to Confederation surveillance, have become the lifeline for what remains of free humanity. I've been underground for 6 days now, ever since the Confederation patrol found my truck and forced me to abandon everything except my radio equipment and the clothes on my back. The chase through the mountain wilderness was a nightmare of scrambling over loose rock and diving behind fallen trees every time I heard the whine of their drones overhead. They hunted me with the methodical efficiency of experienced predators, using heat-sensing equipment and coordinated ground teams that showed they had far more resources than any survivor community could hope to match. I only escaped because of a message transmitted on a frequency I'd never heard before, a voice that guided me to a concealed entrance among the abandoned mine shafts that dot these mountains. The voice belonged to Dana Kessler, the former tech administrator whose data centers had collapsed during the early months of the pandemic. But Dana hadn't simply given up when the digital infrastructure failed. Instead, she had spent the past year building something entirely new, an underground network of hidden relay stations and safe houses that allowed the free survivor communities to communicate without detection by Confederation monitoring systems. Her network, which she simply calls the Underground, has become the nervous system of the resistance movement that's emerging to fight the Confederation's expansion. Dana's operation is hidden in a complex of natural caves and abandoned mining tunnels that extends for miles through the mountainous terrain west of Denver. The location was chosen carefully, deep enough underground to be invisible to aerial surveillance, with multiple entrances and exits that can't be sealed by surface forces, and close enough to the major population centers to intercept and relay communications across the entire region. But what makes the underground truly effective is the technology that Dana has assembled from the wreckage of the old world. She showed me through the main communications chamber on my second day in the tunnels, A cavern that's been transformed into something that looks like a cross between a Cold War bunker and a high-tech laboratory. Banks of computer servers salvaged from abandoned data centers line the walls, powered by a hydroelectric system that taps into an underground stream. Antenna arrays snake through natural fissures in the rock, creating a communications network that can reach across thousands of miles without being detected by surface-based monitoring equipment. Most importantly, the entire system is hardened against electromagnetic pulses and other forms of electronic warfare that the Confederation has been using to disable survivor communications. The underground isn't just a communications network, though. It's become the coordinating center for a resistance movement that includes dozens of survivor communities across the Mountain West. Dana introduced me to the other members of the core leadership team, people whose names I had been hearing on the radio networks for months, but who I was meeting in person for the first time. Marcus Bell, the paramedic who had organized the medical networks, was there coordinating healthcare for resistance operations. Naomi Greer, the librarian who had maintained the information exchanges, was managing intelligence gathering and analysis. Even Jackson Reeve, the photographer who had been documenting the post-collapse world, was contributing by creating detailed maps of Confederation territory and troop movements. But the most important member of the underground leadership was someone I hadn't expected to find. Colonel Sarah Walt, a former military intelligence officer who had deserted from the federal government's remnant forces after learning about their collaboration with the Confederation. Walt's presence explained how the resistance had been able to operate so effectively against a militarily superior enemy. She understood their tactics, their equipment, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Her briefing on the Confederation's true nature was more terrifying than anything I had witnessed during my escape from their territory. According to Walt's intelligence, the Confederation is not actually a grassroots organization of survivor communities that chose to band together for mutual protection. It's a deliberate creation of the federal government's continuity operations, designed to restore centralized control over the post-collapse population through a combination of military force and medical coercion. The immunity treatment that Dr. Camille Rourke developed has been weaponized not just as a tool of control, but as a means of creating a permanent biological hierarchy between the rulers and the ruled. The Confederation's leadership consists primarily of former military officers and government officials who spent the collapse period in secure underground facilities, watching the surface world burn while planning their eventual return to power. They emerged only after the worst of the pandemic had passed, when the surviving population was weak, disorganized, and desperate for security. Their recruitment propaganda emphasizes protection and prosperity, but the reality is systematic enslavement disguised as benevolent governance. Communities that join the Confederation voluntarily find themselves stripped of their autonomy and resources, while those that resist are conquered through overwhelming military force. Walt's intelligence files contain documentation that made my stomach turn. The Confederation's processing centers are not refugee camps or medical facilities, but labor extraction operations where captured survivors are sorted according to their utility value. Those with technical skills or medical training are sent to work sites where they're forced to maintain the Confederation's technological infrastructure. Those with agricultural experience are assigned to farming collectives that produce food for the Confederation's military and administrative personnel. Those deemed physically capable but lacking specialized skills are used for manual labor in mining and construction projects. Most horrifying, those who are considered surplus population simply disappear. Walt's sources within the Confederation suggested that these individuals are being used as test subjects for medical experiments related to the Red Dawn virus, including attempts to weaponize the pathogen for use against resistant communities. The Confederation's ultimate goal appears to be the development of biological weapons that would allow them to eliminate any population that refuses to submit to their authority, creating a world where resistance is literally impossible. The Underground's response to this threat has been to organize a coordinated resistance campaign that combines guerrilla warfare tactics with information operations designed to warn survivor communities about the Confederation's true nature. Dana's communications network allows resistance cells to coordinate their activities across hundreds of miles, sharing intelligence about Confederation movements and planning simultaneous attacks on their supply lines and communication systems. The goal is not to defeat the Confederation in direct military confrontation, which would be impossible given their superior resources, but to disrupt their operations enough to prevent them from consolidating control over the entire survivor population. Walt showed me casualty reports from the past 3 months that documented the deaths of over 200 resistance fighters, including several community leaders whose voices I had been hearing on the radio networks since the early days of the collapse. The Confederation's response to resistance activities has been swift and brutal, with entire communities being relocated to processing centers as punishment for harboring resistance sympathizers. Perhaps most disturbing, the Confederation has begun using the immunity treatment as a weapon against the resistance itself. Intelligence reports suggest that they have developed a modified version of the Red Dawn virus that is specifically designed to overcome the natural immunity that protects about 12% of the population. This weaponized variant is being deployed against resistance strongholds, creating outbreaks that force communities to choose between submitting to Confederation control or watching their populations die from an engineered plague. Dr. Camille Rourke's situation has become a central focus of resistance planning, both because of her symbolic importance and because of the technical knowledge she possesses. Walt's intelligence sources have confirmed that she is being held at the Confederation's primary research facility, where she is being forced to work on developing additional biological weapons under threat of execution. But she has also been sending coded messages through the Confederation's own communication networks, providing the resistance with crucial information about their biological warfare capabilities and potential countermeasures. The resistance is planning a rescue operation designed to extract Camille from the research facility, but the mission will require resources and coordination that will stretch their capabilities to the breaking point. The facility is located in a heavily fortified complex that houses not just research laboratories, but also the Confederation's primary command and control center. Any attack on the facility would essentially be a declaration of all-out war against the Confederation, with consequences that could destroy what remains of the free survivor communities. But the alternative may be even worse. Walt's analysis suggests that the Confederation is preparing for what they call Phase 3 of their consolidation plan, which involves the systematic elimination of all resistance-capable populations through the deployment of engineered biological weapons. The timeline for Phase 3 appears to be accelerating, with intelligence reports indicating that large-scale biological attacks could begin within weeks. The resistance may not have the luxury of waiting for better opportunities or more resources. The psychological toll of living underground and planning for what amounts to a suicide mission has been enormous for everyone involved in the resistance leadership, During my 6 days in the tunnels, I've watched people struggle with the weight of making decisions that will determine the fate of thousands of survivors across the region. The communications equipment that Dana maintains provides a constant stream of desperate messages from communities that are running out of time, food, and hope. Each day brings new reports of Confederation recruitment operations that are stripping communities of their most capable members, leaving behind only the elderly, the sick, and the very young. The children's voices that Elliot Voss had shared from his monastery in Montana have been silent for the past 2 weeks, and intelligence reports suggest that the entire facility has been consolidated into the Confederation's system. The 30 children who had represented hope for the future of free humanity are now presumably being processed through the Confederation's education camps, where they will be indoctrinated into a system that views them as resources rather than human beings. Even the natural world seems to be turning against the resistance efforts. The infected bird populations that had made travel so dangerous during the early years of the pandemic have been showing new patterns of behavior that suggest they may be responding to Confederation control. Intelligence reports describe flocks of infected birds being used as biological reconnaissance assets, with their flight patterns apparently being directed to locate and harass resistance positions. The idea that the Confederation has found ways to weaponize the very pathogen that destroyed civilization is almost too horrible to contemplate. But perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the current situation is the growing realization that the resistance may already be too late to prevent the Confederation's ultimate victory. Their control over the immunity treatment gives them an insurmountable advantage over any population that tries to resist their authority. Their systematic elimination of technical and medical personnel from free communities makes it increasingly impossible for those communities to maintain the basic infrastructure necessary for survival. Most critically, their biological warfare capabilities appear to be advancing faster than the resistance can develop countermeasures. During my final night in the underground tunnels, I participated in what may have been the last strategic planning meeting of the Free Resistance. The decision was made to proceed with the rescue mission to extract Dr. Rourke, not because there was any realistic hope of success, but because the alternative was to surrender without fighting and watch the last vestiges of human freedom disappear into the Confederation's processing centers. The mission would be launched in 72 hours, using every available resource the Resistance possessed in a desperate gamble to strike at the heart of the Confederation's power. As I prepared to leave the tunnels and travel to the mission's staging area, Dana made a request that I hadn't expected. She asked me to document the Resistance's final operations, to create a record that might survive even if the Resistance itself did not. The radio equipment that I had carried from Mount Cascade would be modified to broadcast on frequencies that could penetrate the Confederation's communications blackout, allowing me to transmit in real time as the mission unfolded. If the Resistance failed, my broadcasts might provide crucial intelligence for other survivor communities that were still free to resist. The irony was not lost on me. I had descended from my mountain observatory to participate in the resistance effort, only to find myself once again cast in the role of chronicler and witness. But this time, the story I would be telling might be the final chapter in the history of human freedom, broadcast live as it happened to anyone who might still be listening in the darkness beyond Confederation control. I'm transmitting this message as I prepare to leave the relative safety of the underground tunnels for what will likely be the most dangerous mission of the entire post-collapse period. In 72 hours, a small team of resistance fighters will attempt to penetrate the most heavily defended installation in North America, rescue a scientist whose knowledge could change the course of the war, and strike a blow against an enemy that has overwhelming advantages in personnel, equipment, and biological weapons. The odds of success are essentially zero. The odds of survival for anyone involved in the mission are only slightly better. But the alternative is to watch helplessly as the Confederation completes its transformation of the post-collapse world into a vast prison where human beings exist only to serve the interests of their self-appointed masters. If there is any hope left for the future of human freedom, it lies in the next 72 hours and the courage of people who are willing to die rather than live as slaves. This is Logan Pierce, transmitting from the underground, and tomorrow I'll be broadcasting from the front lines of humanity's last stand. If you're listening to this message, remember that there were people who chose to fight when fighting seemed hopeless, who refused to surrender their freedom even when surrender seemed rational. Whatever happens in the mission ahead, that choice itself is a victory that no confederation can ever take away. This is Logan Pierce, transmitting from a concealed position overlooking the Confederation's primary research facility. It's 3:17 in the morning on day 751 of the Red Dawn pandemic, and in approximately 2 hours, the largest resistance operation since the collapse will either succeed in striking a devastating blow against humanity's oppressors, or it will mark the end of organized opposition to Confederation rule. The facility below me is a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and razor wire that houses not just Dr. Camille Rourke and her forced research, but the technological heart of the Confederation's biological warfare program. The approach to this position has been a journey through hell. For the past 36 hours, our strike team has moved through terrain that the Confederation has systematically poisoned with weaponized variants of the Red Dawn virus. The valleys surrounding the research facility have been turned into biological killing fields, where even the plants and soil have become vectors for engineered pathogens. 3 members of our team died during the approach, their bodies convulsing as modified viruses shut down their respiratory systems within minutes of exposure. We've had to abandon their equipment and continue the mission with dwindling supplies and the knowledge that the air itself is trying to kill us. Colonel Walt's intelligence about the facility's defenses proved accurate but incomplete. The visible security measures are formidable enough. Multiple rings of electrified fencing, automated weapon systems, and patrol routes covered by teams with night vision equipment. But the biological defenses are what make this place truly impregnable. The Confederation has created overlapping zones of contamination that would kill any unprotected person within hours of exposure. Only people who have received their immunity treatments can approach the facility safely, making it effectively impossible for the resistance to mount any kind of conventional assault. Our only advantage is the intelligence that Dr. Rourke has been providing through coded transmissions embedded in the Confederation's own communication networks. Over the past week, she has provided detailed information about the facility's layout, security protocols, and most importantly, the locations of the air filtration systems that keep the research areas free of biological contamination. If we can reach those systems and introduce our own biological agent, we might be able to turn the Confederation's weapons against them. The irony is not lost on me that our plan relies on deploying a biological weapon of our own. Dana Kessler and the Underground's technical team have spent the past month developing what they call a democracy virus, a genetically modified organism that attacks the neural pathways responsible for authoritarian behavior patterns. It sounds like science fiction, but the theoretical basis is sound. If human behavior can be modified by chemical and biological factors, then it should be possible to create agents that promote cooperation and empathy rather than domination and control. The democracy virus is contained in a series of aerosol dispensers that our team is carrying in specially sealed containers. If we can introduce it into the facility's air circulation system, it should affect everyone in the complex within hours, potentially turning the Confederation's own personnel against their authoritarian leadership structure. The effects are supposed to be temporary, lasting only long enough for us to extract Dr. Rourke and gather intelligence about the Confederation's broader operations. But the truth is that we're deploying an untested biological weapon based on theoretical research, and none of us knows what the actual consequences might be. The strike team consists of 8 people, all volunteers who understood that this would likely be a one-way mission. Marcus Bell is here, carrying medical supplies and equipment needed to keep Dr. Rourke alive during the extraction. Jackson Reeve is documenting everything with cameras and recording equipment, creating a visual record of what may be the Resistance's final operation. 2 former military personnel provide tactical expertise, while 3 technical specialists handle the biological warfare deployment and facility infiltration. I'm here as the communications specialist, maintaining contact with the Underground and broadcasting real-time updates to any resistance cells that might still be monitoring our frequencies. The past hour has been spent in final preparations and equipment checks, but also in what amounts to farewell messages. Each team member has recorded personal statements to be transmitted to their communities if they don't survive the mission. Marcus talked about the medical knowledge he's gained during the post-collapse years and his hope that it will help future generations. Jackson described his documentation project and his belief that preserving the truth about this period is essential for humanity's long-term survival. The military specialists shared tactical intelligence that might help other resistance operations. Everyone understood that they were likely recording their own obituaries. At 2:45, we received the final intelligence update from Dr. Rourke. Her coded transmission confirmed that she would be in Laboratory Section C during the early morning hours, working on what the Confederation believes is an enhanced biological weapon, but which is actually a project designed to neutralize their existing viral arsenal. She also confirmed that the facility's primary research data is stored in a central server room that could be accessed during the confusion that our biological attack should create. If we can reach both Dr. Rourke and the data servers, we might be able to not just rescue a valuable person, but also acquire the information needed to develop countermeasures against the Confederation's entire biological warfare program. But Rourke's transmission also included a warning that chilled everyone on the team. The Confederation's Phase 3 biological attacks are scheduled to begin in less than 18 hours, with simultaneous strikes against every major resistance stronghold across the continent. Weaponized viruses will be deployed against communities that have never submitted to Confederation authority, creating outbreaks designed to force mass surrender or complete population elimination. The Underground's tunnel complex is on the target list, along with dozens of other communities whose radio transmissions we've been monitoring for the past 2 years. The timeline means that our mission is no longer just about rescuing Dr. Rourke or gathering intelligence. We're racing against a countdown to biological genocide, and if we fail, the Confederation will have eliminated organized resistance once and for all. The communities that have survived the collapse, adapted to the new world, and maintained their commitment to freedom and cooperation will be destroyed not by the random devastation of pandemic disease, but by the calculated malice of people who believe that human beings exist only to serve their purposes. At 3:05, the first phase of our assault began. The technical specialists infiltrated the facility's perimeter and began their approach to the air circulation systems, while the rest of the team moved toward the main research complex. The biological defenses that had seemed so formidable during our reconnaissance proved vulnerable to the modified immunity treatments that Dana's team had developed from captured Confederation medical supplies. We could move through the contaminated zones without immediate risk, though the long-term effects of exposure remained unknown. The facility's interior was a maze of sterile corridors and laboratory spaces that felt more like a high-tech prison than a research center. Every room we passed contained evidence of the Confederation's biological warfare program, cultures of modified viruses, testing equipment for measuring pathogen virulence, and detailed charts tracking the mortality rates of various engineered diseases. Most disturbing were the holding cells where test subjects were kept, empty now, but showing clear signs of recent occupation. The Confederation had been conducting human experimentation on a scale that rivaled the worst atrocities of the 20th century. We reached Laboratory Section C at 3:28, finding Dr. Rourke exactly where her intelligence had predicted. But the reunion was not what any of us had expected. 2 years of forced collaboration with the Confederation had changed her dramatically, leaving her gaunt and hollow-eyed, but with a fierce determination that burned in her voice as she described the horrors she had been compelled to create. The immunity treatment that had represented such hope for the survivor communities had been perverted into dozens of biological weapons, each designed to target specific genetic markers or behavioral patterns. According to Rourke, the Confederation's ultimate goal was not just political control, but biological transformation of the human species. They were developing viruses that would make empathy and independent thinking literally impossible, creating a population that would be incapable of resistance or rebellion. The Phase 3 attacks were not just intended to eliminate current resistance, but to serve as field tests for pathogens that would be deployed globally once their effectiveness had been proven. The Confederation saw themselves as the architects of a new form of human evolution, one that would eliminate the capacity for freedom from the genetic level. The technical team had successfully deployed the democracy virus into the facility's air circulation system at 3:35, and the effects began manifesting within minutes. Confederation personnel throughout the complex started exhibiting signs of confusion and disorientation as their neural pathways were flooded with chemicals that promoted cooperative behavior over authoritarian impulses. Security guards began questioning their orders and abandoning their posts. Administrative personnel started accessing restricted files and broadcasting information about the Confederation's operations on open radio frequencies. Most remarkably, several military officers began coordinating with our team instead of trying to stop us. But the democracy virus had effects that none of us had anticipated. Instead of simply neutralizing the Confederation's personnel, it was triggering a cascade of psychological breakdowns as people who had been conditioned for authoritarian behavior suddenly found themselves capable of experiencing empathy and moral reasoning. Some personnel became catatonic as their minds tried to process the cognitive dissonance between their actions and their newly activated conscience. Others became violently ill as their bodies rejected the psychological conditioning that had sustained their participation in genocide. The facility became a scene of chaos that was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. Dr. Rourke led us to the central server room at 352, where she began downloading the complete database of the Confederation's biological warfare research. The files contained not just technical specifications for dozens of engineered pathogens, but detailed intelligence about Confederation operations across the continent. We learned the locations of processing centers, the identities of resistance sympathizers who had been captured, and most importantly, the complete timeline and target list for the Phase 3 biological attacks. The intelligence revealed that the Confederation's power was far more extensive than even Colonel Walt had suspected. They controlled territory from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, with only isolated pockets of free territory remaining in the far west and northern Canada. Their military forces numbered in the tens of thousands, equipped with pre-collapse weapons and vehicles that had been maintained in underground storage facilities. Most significantly, they had been in communication with similar organizations in Europe and Asia, suggesting that the authoritarian revival was a global phenomenon rather than a uniquely American development. But the intelligence also revealed critical vulnerabilities in the Confederation's structure. Their biological warfare program was centralized in a handful of facilities, making it possible to disrupt their entire capability through coordinated attacks. Their leadership structure was hierarchical and rigid, making it vulnerable to the kind of psychological disruption that the democracy virus was already causing. Most importantly, their control over the population was maintained primarily through medical coercion rather than genuine loyalty, meaning that their authority would collapse quickly if the immunity treatments became widely available. At 4:07, as we prepared to extract Dr. Rourke and the stolen intelligence, the facility's emergency systems activated in response to what the automated announcements described as a biological containment breach. The democracy virus had spread beyond the air circulation system and was affecting Confederation personnel across the entire complex. Military units that had been stationed outside the facility were beginning to experience the same psychological effects, leading to mass desertion and equipment abandonment. The Confederation's command structure was dissolving in real time as their own personnel became incapable of following authoritarian orders. The extraction itself was surreal as we moved through corridors filled with Confederation personnel who were either fleeing in panic or actively helping us escape. The psychological transformation triggered by the democracy virus was so complete that many of them were voluntarily providing intelligence about Confederation operations and expressing genuine remorse for their participation in atrocities. Some were attempting to contact resistance groups to offer their assistance, while others were simply sitting in stunned silence as they processed the moral weight of what they had been doing. We reached the facility's perimeter at 4:23, carrying Dr. Rourke and several terabytes of Confederation intelligence data. But as we prepared to escape into the contaminated wilderness, Rourke made a request that none of us had expected. She wanted to return to the facility to continue her research, not as a prisoner of the Confederation, but as a free scientist working to develop countermeasures against their biological weapons. The democracy virus had created a window of opportunity that might never open again, and she believed that the facility's research equipment could be used to develop treatments that would protect the remaining free communities. The decision to leave her behind was one of the most difficult choices of the entire mission. Dr. Rourke represented not just a valuable person, but a symbol of hope for the resistance movement. But she was also the only person with the knowledge and expertise needed to turn the Confederation's own weapons against them. Her decision to stay at the facility and continue her work might be the key to preventing the Phase 3 biological attacks and developing the medical countermeasures that could eventually liberate the entire continent from Confederation control. As our team withdrew from the facility, carrying the intelligence data that would be crucial for coordinating resistance operations, I maintained radio contact with Dr. Rourke as she began her new work as a free researcher in a liberated laboratory. Her first transmission was a detailed analysis of the Phase 3 biological weapons and preliminary protocols for developing vaccines and treatments. But her second transmission was something entirely unexpected. A message to the Confederation's remaining leadership, broadcast on their own command frequencies. Rourke's message was a formal declaration that the facility was now under the control of the International Committee for Biological Ethics, an organization that existed only in her imagination, but which she described with such authority that Confederation personnel across the continent began reporting to it for orders. She announced that all biological warfare programs were being terminated immediately, and that Confederation medical resources would be redirected toward developing treatments for the communities they had been planning to attack. Most remarkably, she announced that immunity treatments would be made freely available to all surviving human populations, regardless of their political affiliation or resistance status. The psychological impact of Rourke's declaration was amplified by the continuing effects of the democracy virus, which had spread far beyond the research facility through Confederation communication networks and supply chains. Personnel throughout their command structure were experiencing the same transformation from authoritarian to cooperative behavior, leading to mass defections and the spontaneous emergence of democratic decision-making processes within Confederation units. Military commanders were abandoning their orders to attack resistance communities and instead were opening negotiations for peaceful coexistence. As our team reached the safety of the mountain wilderness, it was clear that the Confederation as an authoritarian organization had effectively ceased to exist. The biological weapon that had been intended to eliminate resistance had instead eliminated the psychological foundations of authoritarianism itself. The Phase 3 attacks had been canceled by the very personnel who were supposed to carry them out, and Confederation resources were being redirected toward humanitarian assistance for the communities they had been planning to destroy. This is Logan Pierce, transmitting from the mountains above what used to be called the Confederation's primary research facility and is now known as the Rocky Mountain Center for Biological Ethics. The mission that was supposed to be humanity's last stand has instead become the catalyst for the most remarkable transformation in human social organization since the original collapse. The democracy virus has proven that human behavior can indeed be modified through biological intervention, but in ways that promote freedom and cooperation rather than control and submission. The communities that have survived the Red Dawn pandemic are now facing a new challenge: how to build a society based on genuine cooperation rather than the coercive authority that has dominated human civilization for thousands of years. Dr. Rourke's research suggests that the psychological changes triggered by the democracy virus may be permanent, making it impossible for traditional authoritarian structures to reestablish themselves. We may be witnessing the emergence of the first truly post-hierarchical human civilization, one where political power is literally impossible to concentrate in the hands of a few individuals. But challenges remain. The immunity treatments are still in limited supply, and large areas of the continent remain contaminated with biological weapons that will take years to neutralize. The infrastructure of civilization has been largely destroyed, and rebuilding will require coordination and cooperation on a scale that has never been attempted before. Most importantly, the long-term effects of the democracy virus remain unknown, and there is no guarantee that the psychological changes it has triggered will prove beneficial or even stable over time. Tomorrow I'll be traveling to the First Continental Congress of Free Communities, where representatives from across North America will gather to discuss the challenges of building a new form of human society from the ashes of the old world. The voices that have sustained us through the collapse, the quiet months, the resistance, and the final breaking point are now preparing to speak with one voice about the future of human freedom. This is Logan Pierce, signing off from the mountains, and tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding begins.